Greetings and welcome to the VIA Cafe and to VIA Voices. My name is John Fanistel, Executive Director here at VIA International. And with the rest of the team from here at VIA International and the VIA Cafe, we welcome you. The VIA Cafe is a new online digital platform through which our team at VIA International is attempting to extend our reach and make the resources of our organization and our networks available to people from near and far. And the VIA Voices is a weekly conversation with change makers, leaders, and organizers in communities from across borders with a special emphasis on the place where we're located, which is here in San Diego, California. So we're interviewing leaders from along the San Diego-Tijuana border region. Today we have with us Pedro Rios of the American Friends Service Committee, and I'll introduce him to you in just a minute. But we bid you welcome. We're glad you're here. We thank you for joining us. Bienvenidos a todos. I just do want to say a word about the format of today's meeting. Just a few introductory remarks, and then I'll be interviewing Pedro for 20-25 minutes. During that period of time, if there are questions that come to you, we'd encourage you to write those questions down in the chat room on your screen. And we'll attempt to lift as many of those questions as we can a little later in the program. We'll also encourage you to check out the VIA Cafe. It's at viacafe.org. And I especially want to just give a shout out and thank you to some of our sponsors. Jim Gerber, Sandra Pashal, Lisa Sabatini, and Gloria Sandvik have sponsored this VIA Voices program, and we'll encourage you to do the same if you're able at the end of the program. I'll also extend an invitation for you to sign up to receive the invitations to these weekly conversations automatically so that you don't have to register each time. But those invitations will come a little later. For now, we get to launch right into our conversation with Pedro Rios. And it's a special pleasure for me because Pedro and I have had I've had the pleasure of working with Pedro on a number of projects across the years. And Pedro's a longtime organizer with the American Friends Service Committee. They're director of their U.S.-Mexico border program and a champion of human rights here in the San Diego-Tijuana border region. So I'd invite you to join me with just a quick round of applause as we welcome Pedro to this conversation. Pedro, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, John. Thank you. It's such a pleasure to join you today. And thank you to everyone else that joined. I saw some of you are enjoying your lunch. So buen provecho.
Very good. Indeed. Buen provecho. And Pedro, thanks for taking a time out from your lunch break to have this conversation with us. Pedro, I wanted to start with what's hot and current in the news. And I'm curious to know whether you were surprised by the recent outpouring of support that has been mobilized around the Black Lives Movement. Is that something that you were already following, something that you're following closely now?
Yeah, following it pretty closely. I'm not sure if surprise is the right word, I would say. I think for the most part on my end, I think, you know, the American Friends Service Committee has programs throughout the country, some of which have been hotspots in the past where police brutality has ended in the death of young Black men. And so it's not something that's surprising in terms of what has been occurring around the country now for decades, and if we look at it at a historical context for several hundred years in terms of the what the trademark has been of this country's history. But I think the surprising aspect, if I could say that there is a surprising aspect, has been how more or less white communities have come out to express their support. And I think there's something there tied to the COVID-19 pandemic, the sense of folks being tied to their homes and maybe their lives have been changed pretty dramatically, where there's much more opportunities to analyze and explore the meaning of police brutality within the context of the broader Black Lives Movement. When Eric Gardner and George Floyd said, you know, "I can't breathe," I think that really captured the sentiment of repressive tactics and how communities of color, but more precisely Black communities, have felt for generations when you have institutional measures that tend to restrict movement, that tend to really place limitations on how young Black men, young Black women are unable to really enjoy life in the same way that others might. I think that, you know, it really pushes on the meaning of what those restrictions are. And so the surprising aspect has been more of how much energy and has been around this movement now, and the possibilities that that might bring forward in terms of changes to policies and how we see the role of police and entities in our communities.
I want to return to that theme of the organizing possibilities of the moment, but let me just explore a little bit more about you mentioned your role with AFSC and organizing around the country. So you're through that, you know, through your own work with AFSC, and it sounds like you're already very much connected to Black Lives Matter. Do you feel like the connection between the Black Lives Matter movement and border organizers like yourself, border leaders, border communities, is that connection being strengthened through this period of time, or do you see new connections being developed? How do you see that relationship unfolding in the current time?
I do see that that there is a connection being drawn between what already existed, and so you know, we've done a lot of work here along the border with people that have died because of brutality by Customs and Border Protection agents, namely Border Patrol, and also ICE and the institutions that they represent. So the case that you might be more familiar with is the Anastasio Hernandez Rojas case, where he was brutalized and beaten by over a dozen agents, some of which were supervising agents that were involved in that case now 10 years ago. And one of the reflections I had when George Floyd was killed was George Floyd was calling for his mother. Similarly, Anastasio, when he was being beaten and brutalized, he also called for his mother when he was beaten. And so those connections in a much more contemporary sense are there. Certainly they are being strengthened by us exploring what it means to challenge white supremacist practices, what it means when we call for dismantling systems that invest in white supremacy, and calling for white allies to join us in that movement. And so certainly there's a lot of straightening in how we move our work together.
Yeah, I've been hanging around the border for a long time before it occurred to me that in so many respects, people who live along the border here in the United States, oftentimes their relationship with local law enforcement, their principal or primary relationship is probably with the U.S. Border Patrol. Those are the most prevalent agents on the ground. They're most likely to run across or run into. And that made me wonder, you know, at the time, and I continue to wonder, you know, that parallel is our border communities' relationship with Border Patrol analogous in some ways to the communities in major metropolitan areas around the United States and their local police departments. Do you see, is that parallel that sometimes I ponder? Is that a parallel that rings true with you?
I think there are some parallels there, and there are certainly some distinct differences, one of which is for local municipal police departments, there has been a move now for several decades to try, you know, the concept of community policing, where you bring members of a community to be involved in the policing of that same community. I think there are a lot of criticisms of whether that strategy works or not. With Border Patrol, I haven't really seen any real concerted effort to involve Border Patrol in any sort of community policing. In fact, I would say that there really isn't any interest from the agency to do that. And I think one of the reasons is that a lot of Border Patrol agents, when they get hired, they get moved around to different locations, which is part of the training. And actually, I think it's part of the practice of dehumanizing people. And so if you bring in police forces that are not from your community, you can't identify with that community. And so it's much more easier to repress that community. That's been one of the practice that we have seen around the world. Mexico, when they started creating their newer police forces after the uprising of the Zapatistas in the mid-90s, they started shifting police agencies from their communities to outside communities in order to make it easier for them to be involved in repressive tactics. So it's not something new. In fact, I would say it's part of a strategy that we've identified as low intensity conflict strategy, and which makes it then easier to normalize the violence and normalizes this type of behavior by people that are involved in law enforcement practices.
Yeah, so I hear you saying it also almost sounds to me like and this gets to this question of maybe the relationship between local border efforts and defund the police or defunding police strategies. Sounds to me like you see some structural problems with the way the organization, Border Patrol is organized. This rotating of staff, for instance, disconnection from communities. Do you think are these really structural, foundational problems to the organization that is Customs and Border Protection and specifically U.S. Border Patrol? Could these institutions be reformed, or do you feel like it's more the case that the structure of the organization requires that it be abolished? For instance, abolish ICE is another rallying cry these days.
Yeah, those are good questions, because I think they bring up a lot of sentiments for people, and they sort of uproot what we've understood to be the police as an institution that we have to see. And kids grow up playing with police toys, and again, it's this idea of being normalized. But if we look at their history and the history of slave patrols and how they morphed into police forces, the root of the problem, I think, has yet to be addressed. Similarly with the Border Patrol. Their creation in 1924 was essentially to try to control who was coming into the US at the time to work. At that time, they were under a separate department, and as the years have gone by, they were then under the Department of Justice and now under the Department of Homeland Security, much more militarized in terms of how they operate. And so I don't know if they can be reformed. I've written in the past about how the Border Patrol comes from a history that's very problematic to the borderlands, where they recruited from the Texas Ranger and from the Arizona Rangers, and where they were involved in lynching of Mexicans, very bloody years during the turn of the century, and even up towards 1924. And so I don't know if you can reform a police force, in this case a Border Patrol, that was born out of violence, that perpetuates violence, that does not operate in any other way but expecting impunity in how it moves forward with implementing enforcement policies.
Yeah, that history is fascinating to me. There was one of the early Spanish language periodistas in California, Francisco Ramirez, called early California under statehood a lynchocracia, a lynchocracy, because lynchings were in fact so prevalent. And that's another connection between the two movements that I haven't heard a lot of talk. Do you hear much talk about that history of lynching of Mexican ancestry folks in the the history of California or the history of the borderlands? Is that a history that you're familiar with, that you find organizers are familiar with in general?
There's newer scholarship coming out about the lynching of Mexicans. Some, unfortunately, some will say the lynching of Hispanics, which I think is a misnomer. This was very specific to the Mexican community, and just a couple decades after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, when the U.S. took about half of Mexican territory. And so that feeling of conquest, of taking land, of usurping land, was still prevalent during those days. And there was a period in Texas known as La Matanza, which was lasted about a decade, where rampant lynching of Mexicans and Mexican Americans at that time, because now they're newly U.S. citizens, and Chicanos was prevalent. And so my hope is that it does become a history that it's much widely known in the organizing community, so that then we can draw those parallels that are much needed, that unite our history with the Black community, and be able to identify causal effect, instead of the divide and conquer that oftentimes separates our community struggles. Yeah,
that's another theme, of course, that seems to be very prevalent in the current upswell of energy and organizing, is the wanting to revisit the history and to reclaim history, to narrate history from different perspectives, to erase and or to contextualize monuments, for instance, of course, is the big, in the headlines these days. Do you think of that work of retelling the story of the borderlands? Is that, how do you, it sounds, I know you're a historian yourself and a student of this history. Is that part of the kind of foundational work that needs to be done to energize and mobilize our communities?
I think it definitely is. I think it has to be a part of the story, and oftentimes the history that we learn in our U.S. history classes in 5th and 8th and 10th grade, if I remember correctly, tends to be a watered down history. It tends to be a history that is meant to placate a certain populace, and we don't necessarily get to understand or really venture in a much more profound way the depthness of some of the events that occurred in the history of the U.S. and again centered around violence, but also about how we persevere as communities and how we move forward and how we challenge the systems in a way that create broader rights for all. And so I think that the history is something that we have to tell in order for our truth to also be on the table. And so if we learn a particular Eurocentric perspective in our history, then as people of color, myself as a Chicano, I don't get to center myself and my how I'm related to this broader fabric of history and how it gets told. And I think without that history, then the cyclical nature of inconformity based on perhaps a reality that doesn't belong to me leaves me disconnected, leaves me without understanding my own family background, cultural heritage, and so on and so forth. And so that history is precisely why we need to question the monuments that are supposed to tell and convey a certain narrative that doesn't necessarily belong to us. And so here in Chula Vista, where I live, when we're questioning the statue of Christopher Columbus, whose history is left out? And it makes it seem as though that's the established truth when, we also have stories to tell.
Yeah, so that I'm struck by the kind of the imposition, from outside. It's the imposition of a narrative, and a white supremacy ideology, and simultaneously then the institutional imposition of force, as you mentioned, in the form of the Border Patrol. So, again, it's I don't know. I despair sometimes. Is the DNA of I myself a white Protestant. This is very much white Protestant stuff. White Protestant American supremacy. And now you mentioned seeing so many white allies emerge. Do you think white folks need to? Do we need to unlearn the history we've been taught? What would you recommend to folks who want to be allies to this movement in this space of culture and history and narrative?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a lot of unlearning that has to happen. There's a lot of decolonization that needs to happen. I think the movement towards establishing ethnic studies and in curriculum throughout California and Arizona and other places is really important because that offers that diverse perspective of a different worldview that isn't centered on a Eurocentric perspective, for instance. And so I think that unlearning has to happen, but then there has to be a relearning or a learning of anew of these different storytelling ways and stories that have been suppressed and have been quieted purposefully for such a long time.
Well, yeah, thanks for that. I appreciate your writing in that regard and the conversations we've had in the past. I look forward to continuing those. Leaping a little bit back toward the present, the other dimension that I see so powerful is this, as you mentioned, this institutional context, Border Patrol or Customs Border Protection under the Department of Homeland Security, as of, post 9/11, so that everything, as we've discussed before in our work on Friendship Park, for instance, everything is about security. Nothing that happens on the border isn't a threat to national security within this frame of mind, because it's all, is the Department of Homeland Security, is that part of the problem? Is it this larger institutional frame? So much of this happens at federal level, right? The federal policy. Does the federal government, have to play out, if the borderlands were to be reformed, I guess I'm asking, is this going to require federal policy changes and structural changes at the federal level?
I absolutely think it does. And we have to recall that the Department of Homeland Security was created after the attacks on September 11th of 2001, which I think what happened was that they brought in, I think it's around 19 separate departments or agencies into one single department with the sole focus of being secure minded or security conscious. But really, I think it brings up a question about whose security are we seeing that is being protected. And for the most part, when we look at agencies such as Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, they tend to create much more harm than any good. We've seen so many families that have been separated, so many lives that have been traumatized. I've talked to many children and their parents who are now separated that have lived through a traumatic ICE raid, immigration raid, and still have not been able to move forward from that experience. And so when we have an agency that's sanctioned by the government to terrorize communities, I think we need to raise the question about what their purpose is. And I think goes back to one of your earlier questions, do we move towards abolishment? Is this where we want to be? But then what else do we, what replaces that? And I think that's a question I think that we need to really delve deep into as communities and look at what experiences have been there in the past. So definitely will involve policy at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level. Whether there's a political appetite for that is a different story. I certainly have seen much more criticism around who our elected officials are, how they get elected. It's been great to see a lot more movement of people wanting to be politically active. And I think the best way to do that is when it's done collectively, when there's organization behind that, and when there's a process of consulting those that are most directly impacted, that they should be at the forefront of determining the policies that will most impact their lives.
Yeah, so that sense of the borderlands as these unique, the home to these unique local communities. Your own history as a borderlands family, am I right? Your own family you think of yourself as a fronterizo, a borderlander, is that true?
I do, I'm a fronterizo. I live and grew up here in the borderlands. Both of my parents have an interesting migration history as well. My paternal grandparents were born in Los Angeles, and during the repatriation period in the 1930s, even though they were US citizens, they were deported to Mexico and made their life there. And that's where my father was born. My mother arrived to the US after a history of her own father, my maternal grandfather, working as a bracero, coming to the US on a cyclical basis to work the fields and follow the fields. And eventually the family decided that they could not live separated in that way. And my grandmother moved to Tijuana and lived there for a while and eventually made their way to the US. And so it's this migration history that it's not, I think, unique to myself, but it's really part of how the borderlands and fronterizos and fronterizas tell their story of who they are.
Well, yeah, so in that regard, I want to just pick up a theme that we discussed last week with our guest last week was Graciela Zamudio of the organization Alma Migrante based in Tijuana. And we were chatting a little bit about the difference between, US-based conversations often are framed in terms of civil rights. And especially I think of the history of Black Americans organizing under the banner of civil rights, the civil rights movement. And again, perhaps, the Black Lives Movement today as a new generation's expression of that. But Graciela, as a Mexican, of course, is more familiar with the framework of human rights and thinks of her organizing in that international context. As a borderlander, do you find yourself fighting on multiple battles? Do you think of, are you a civil rights organizer and a human rights organizer? Or do you have to do many things at once? Are they both just doing the same thing under different names? How do you think about that relationship between civil rights and human rights?
Yeah, I mean, I see human rights as being the broader umbrella and civil rights being one aspect of how you struggle, how you defend, how you fight for human rights. So civil rights is a part of a larger process that I think the umbrella is human rights. But I think, even that question, or not that the question that you asked, but even the issue of human rights tends to be framed around the confines of the nation state. And that's how the United Nations applies the concept of human rights. And I think even that concept is somewhat outdated now. And we need to look at how you know, what our relationship is to each other beyond the confines of the nation state, that we need to see how human rights are sort of a larger application that should be applied equally to everyone without distinction of whether you're from the US or you're from Mexico or you're from Ghana, or wherever you might be from. But unfortunately, we see that, normally we see that in terms of how, you know, cross-border shootings where Border Patrol has been involved in shooting people in Mexico, and US courts have determined that civil rights, constitutional protections don't apply to those who were shot and killed in Mexico, even cases where minors were shot and killed. And so that's where there are limitations to the application of the Constitution, and we need to look at the broader human rights framework as how we move forward with our work and ensure that the nation state limitations don't deprive someone of life and liberty.
Yeah, that I've always felt for my own, you know, life living and working along the borderlands. I've always felt that was one of the great gifts that borderlands people have to offer. You know, that sentiment of no soy de aquí ni de allá, or, you know, or positively framed soy de aquí y soy de allá. That the nation state doesn't really capture the whole picture. If you work within that confines, it's inherently partial. Am I making sense in your way of thinking?
Yeah, there's actually a word called nepantla. It's a word that essentially means sort of an in-between state. And many years ago, friends of mine talked about having a shop somewhere around the border region, calling it nepantla. It's this in-between state, you know, not here or from there, but also here and from there. And so I think that it does capture the essence of what it means to be a fronterizo. Certainly here along the US-Mexico border, but I would argue that probably similar sorts of experiences along border communities in other parts of the world.
Yeah, thanks for that. Well, thanks so much, Pedro, for your work in the first place and for your collaboration across the years. It's been a privilege to work with you, to learn from you, to learn with you. And we really appreciate your being here today. So thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I'm going to open it up to questions. Once again, if you'd like to drop a question down in the chat room, our staff will lift that up. And just as we get prepared for some conversation with Pedro, I just want to lift up a couple of opportunities. Many of you will have registered for today's charla by registering just for this one event. If you'd like to register, receive each week's invitation without having to register for each event, we've launched a little grouping that we're calling Via Voices Champions. And these are people who would receive the invitation to each week's session. And then all we ask in exchange is that you help to champion the cause, spread the word, invite your friends, like our Facebook page. We are now just opening brand new YouTube channel where these Via Voices will be archived. So if you'd like to revisit a previous session, you'll find it at our YouTube channel. So if you'd like to be a champion on Via Voices, the link is now in your chat room, and you can just click on that, sign up one time, we'll send you the weekly email to these Via Voices invitation. And very good. With that, I'm going to see if my colleagues, Elisa Sabatini, Rigoberto Reyes, if there are any questions of your own that you'd like to lift up, or questions from the chat room. What would you like to bring to Pedro's attention?
Well, I'll start and say that there was an interesting one here about what Black Lives Matter may be learning from migrant struggles. Do you think there's some of that cross-learning happening?
Yeah, I think there is. And internally within the American Friends Service Committee, we've had a series of conversations precisely around this topic. You know, how do we lift up each other's work? And I mean, we've learned so much, I think, over the years within the migrant rights movement. This is something that people will often say when ICE detains someone. They typically will say, you know, well, they treated me like a criminal. As so people that have been criminalized should be treated in a degrading way. And so there's a lot of learning that goes back and forth. You know, certainly I think how especially the young people in the migrant rights movement talk about moving forward, picking up all of their family members. And so the dreamers will say that the original dreamers were the parents who migrated to the US because they had a dream of a better life. And so I think there's a lot of learning that can be shared back and forth, and a lot of historic examples of where Black and Brown unity isn't only tied to a contemporary phenomena, but it's gone back for generations. And I think that goes back to the question about relearning our history, that once we see that, I think that it makes it easier for us to be able to work together and in the broader migrants' rights movement beyond just migrants from Latin American countries. I think there's a lot there that we can learn from as well.
Thanks for that. Other questions from the chat room?
Yes, we do have another question. It might be a comment. It says, wasn't aware, this is coming from Michael. I wasn't aware that the Border Patrol agents are rotated. It does seem incredibly problematic in the ways that foster the dehumanization of migrants. Is that a standard practice?
Yeah, and you know, and I'm sure John can talk about this too. I mean, when Border Patrol assigns an agent that is supposed to be charged with overseeing Friendship Park and the space in between what they call the enforcement zone, every 2 or 3 years they'll change that agent out, and oftentimes it seems as though we have to start all over again with how we interact with the agents, the agreements that we've made together. There were times when we would meet in Washington, D.C. with high-ranking Border Patrol officials, and then when we had to travel again, it was a new set of agents that we were meeting with and having to start all over again. And so it was definitely a normal practice that they've done that for since that I can remember.
Yeah, and on that vein, Pedro, you're right. I share that experience, as we've discussed many times in our work with Friendship Park. But you mentioned something interesting too, the notion that agents are so often brought in from outside of the area, even from one part of the border to another, but lacking that contextual, relational dimension to their work with communities. Have you found some Border Patrol agents just inherently have you know, kind of a gift in the realm of cultural competence or community relations? Is there, you know, are individuals able to make a difference even within the context of that institution?
I think some are. You know, I think there are some that are much more adept at understanding that they're entering a community with which they are unfamiliar, and so there's a learning curve that they have to undertake. I think once you get to know someone and there's an appreciation for their humanity, and I say that in a much more general sense, because I mean, how many times, I can't tell you how many times I've heard a Border Patrol agent say, but you know, my wife is Mexican, or I travel to Mexico on a regular basis, and so you know, that's not the cultural competency that we're looking for, right? But that's sort of what agents carry forward oftentimes, and I think sometimes it's just not having the ability to really delve deep into perhaps the challenges that they have as agents. And similarly, I think that there is a sense within a culture within the Border Patrol that tends to depict migrants as potential or prone to criminal activity or prone to creating harm. And so we see this in the rhetoric that comes out of the White House that's been used to describe migrants. I mean, migrants are aliens, right? That's the official terminology of how we refer to migrants in the legal world. Yeah,
so you have the cultural competence at the individual level is one thing, but then you're back to the larger culture of the institution and the cultural context of white supremacy, as we discussed. So let's see, other questions. Rigo, Elisa, anything else?
Quite a powerful one here. Have you seen methods for helping folks who are anti-immigrant become more empathetic and open to migrants and refugees? And could any of these methods be adapted to foster openness and empathy between white folks with white supremacist attitudes and Black peoples?
I think the best method that I've seen work is storytelling and humanizing the experiences. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of times there's such a degree of, I don't want to talk to that person, stay away because of the labeling that happens, but also the privileges that people feel entitled to the sort of feeling of not in my backyard, and just a general sense of fear of the other. And because migrants tend to be otherized historically for such a long time, it's difficult to break that cycle. But when storytelling happens, when there's a personal connection with people of opposing viewpoints, then that's when there's a much more probability of getting to a point of understanding each other's place. The power relationship is different there, though. If you have someone who has greater power, then they have a lower risk of making themselves vulnerable to that possibility of change.
Mm-hmm. Well, kind of in that vein, I'm thinking about some of the stories and the history being told. I'm thinking about Chicano Park and all the stories that the murals depict. And for those of you that are in the San Diego area, it's worth a drive down to see the new mural underway, which will be honoring Anastasio Hernandez Rojas. And we will have Victor on a later, Victor the artist on a later via Voices. But I do think that storytelling and sharing of culture is just such a rich opportunity for people. And turning back a little bit to the border culture, a specific question: do you feel there are different perceptions within the Chicano-Mexicano community here on the border between police versus the Border Patrol, or is it the same? For example, growing up in the Border Patrol was La Migra, and the police was and remains called La Chota.
Yeah, there's a saying that we have, and you hear this in marches all the time, which is "La migra, la policía, la misma porquería," and unfortunately, it's, and so community members along the border, I would say, see the police and immigration as oftentimes as the same sort of apparatus of the state to repress people, where there are different powers that they might have, and I think that's why there has been such a concerted effort over the past 10 years to try to, in the state of California, to separate the function of the police versus the function of immigration, Border Patrol, or ICE. And so we've been successful in a lot of advocacy around that area. So there are a lot of similarities with the role. I think the base is the repressive tactics that they take, the collaborative nature that they have. Even to this day in San Diego County, there are some police departments, and I won't name names, but there are some that would openly collaborate if they could under the law with immigration enforcement. That would be just a tremendous impact on the lives of working families. And so definitely similar, with some differences that are nuances in those differences, but similar perspectives historically in terms of the repressive nature of police forces.
And as we're winding down, here's a recommendation from Dr. Alberto Pulido in regards to the conversation we were having earlier as far as the Texas Rangers. He's recommending a book that's known as The Cult of Glory, The Bold and Brutal History of Texas Rangers by Doug J. Swanson. It's a new publication if people are interested in looking more deeper into that.
Thanks for that, Rigo. And we'll try to make that list, and there's some other recommendations and suggestions in the chat room. We'll try to make those available maybe in the comment section of our YouTube channel. Any last questions? I want to make one quick pitch for our Via Cafe before we close. Any, Rigo, Elisa, any other questions to lift up from the chat room before we prepare to close?
Well, I was just going to call people's attention to the chat room because there are various other comments that are pretty powerful, pretty interesting testimonies from our listeners. So if you can click on your chat button, you'll see some of that there.
Great. And thanks. Well, let me then just share briefly with you the Via Cafe. If you haven't yet visited, it's at viacafe.org. And if you go to the homepage, you'll see a variety of opportunities to connect with people from along and across the border. This Via Voices program is the one that you're participating in right now. And just to give you a heads up of what's coming, we want to thank again our sponsors. Elisa, thank you for leading the charge with our friends Jim and Sandra and Gloria to become a sponsor of Via Voices. And then if you'd like to just get a free single ticket to the next event, you can do that here. Next week's conversation will be with Lisbeth de la Cruz Santana. Lisbeth is an organizer in the DREAM movement, works with undocumented immigrants as well as folks with the status of DACA. She also works across the border. She's a digital media specialist who's been active with our deported friends in Tijuana. And so we're looking forward to talking with Lisbeth as this new chapter emerges in the movement for the rights of those who were brought to the United States as childhood arrivals. So that's next Tuesday, 12 noon. Again, if you'd like to get a ticket just to the single event, you can do that here. Or if you'd like to get the reminders automatically, you can sign up as a champion. And once again, all of that is at viacafe.org. Pedro, before we close, I thought I'd just ask one last question of you, in that I know you're a runner. And I'm curious to know if you've been able to keep up your running through the quarantine period. And then at a more philosophical level, maybe, do you feel like the mentality of a runner helps you as an organizer, or do you see a connection between your life as an organizer and your life as a long distance runner?
Yeah. You know, I started running about 10 years ago, and I think it really offers me an opportunity to center myself as I'm running, really think through. I've had a couple of moments when I'm running that I really, you know, sometimes some people will say, how do they describe it, where they say they have the, anyway, I'm losing off track. But yeah, I think it's an important way of centering myself, of really finding some peace. If running serves as meditation, I think it definitely works that way for me. I have been running. I completed a solo marathon 2 weeks ago. And so it's just something that I continue to do, and it gets me out, and I'm able to do it in a way that's safe and doesn't expose me to anyone who might be contracted with the disease. And I think on that deeper level, there's a possibility of if we're to keep doing the work that we're doing as healthy individuals, then I think we need to make a concerted effort to define that health practice that makes sense for you personally, and in order for you to keep going. And for me, it's been running. Yeah.
Well, great. Well, thank you again. Just as we close, I'd invite all of you, if you're willing, just to join me in with a big round of applause and appreciation to Pedro for joining us. Pedro, we really appreciate you, and we'll continue to count ourselves in solidarity with your efforts. On another occasion, perhaps we can talk more about American Friends Service Committee. There was I mentioned in the chat room about that, about other dimensions of your work. But we sure appreciate your insights into this moment and these connections that are perhaps have always been there, but for some of us are really arising to the forefront of our awareness, these connections between the social justice struggles of the borderlands and of the Black Lives Matter movement. So we sure appreciate your being here with us today, Pedro. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Very good. Thanks so much for joining us, everyone. We'll see you again, same time, same place next week. Be in touch, drop a line anytime. Viacafe.org is where you'll find our online platform. Thanks for joining us.